me somebody very special. This is H.J. Rogers, man about town, owner of a gigantic fluffy mustache. In 1882, he was one of the richest men in the city of Appleton, Wisconsin. He owned a paper mill in town. He was literally building a mansion on the hill. And then that summer, H.J. Rogers made a fateful decision. He went on a fishing trip with a salesman from the Edison Electric Lighting Company. Now, at the time, H.J. Rogers had never seen an electric light bulb. In fact, he actually owned the gas lighting utility in Appleton, so technically electricity was an up-and-coming competitor for him. But he came back from that fishing trip, the proud owner of the rights to license and use Edison's technology in the city of Appleton. This would be the beginning of the end for him as a successful businessman. I really like this story because it kind of goes against the narrative that most of us learned in junior high and high school. This idea that Thomas Edison invents the electric light in 1879 and everything just sort of falls together. That electricity is this killer app that everyone knew that they wanted and it solved a problem everyone knew that they had. But the reality is a lot more complicated than that. In reality, this is the guy who invented the electric light. His name's Humphrey Davy. He was a chemist. He's better known for discovering the elements of potassium and sodium. And in 1802, he became the first person to run an electric current through a thin filament of wire, heating that wire up to the point that it began to glow and produce light. He invented the electric light bulb. And between Humphrey Davy and Thomas Edison, you've got 80 years of different inventors tinkering around with this technology that was never quite ready for prime time. This is a really important story, I think, because by 1882, when H.J. Rogers came along, electricity still wasn't a sure thing. We have these mythologies we like to tell ourselves about innovation. That innovation is what happens when one guy has one great idea that totally changes the world. But reality is a lot messier than that. In reality, good ideas fail all the time. In reality, success is preceded by lots and lots and lots of failure. And knowing what actually happens, where innovation actually comes from, is increasingly important to us. We're caught in the middle of several different energy crises right now. We have dwindling supplies of fossil fuels, we have aging infrastructure, we have climate change. All these things kind of converging on us all at the same time. And the only way that we're getting out of this problem is through innovation. But if we have this idea that innovation is something that just happens easily, if we don't actually know where innovation comes from and what it takes to do it, we're not going to know how to solve our problems or even really what our problems are. This is a big reason why I wrote my book Before the Lights Go Out. I want to help people understand how our infrastructure works today, but also where it came from, and how it's affecting what we can and can't do about energy in the future. And to tell you that story, I have to start in the state of Wisconsin. In 1882, it was hard at work in New York City building what would become the world's first centralized electric grid. But his grid opened 2 weeks before the one in Appleton. Appleton, Wisconsin's grid was the second centralized electric grid in the world. It was the first hydroelectric power plant in the world. And more importantly, it was the first place that somebody other than Thomas Edison, without Edison's team of geniuses working around him, tried to take this technology and put it to use in the real world. And they failed miserably. And when you understand why H.J. Rogers failed, you'll understand a lot more about how our grid works and where it came from. H.J. Rogers' first problem was a technological problem. Specifically, he had absolutely no idea what he was doing with the technology that he had purchased from Edison. He had bought the rights to use this technology. He had not really bought anyone to come and tell him what to do with it. In 1882, there was no such thing as guys like this, electric linemen, that work on the basics of electricity today. There wasn't really anything such as an electrical engineer. Thomas Edison's staff was inventing that job back in New York, and none of them could come all the way out to Appleton with the electric generator that H.J. Rogers purchased. So H.J. Rogers didn't know how to make the grid work, and that is actually a bigger problem than he realized. I like to compare the electric grid to a water park, to the lazy river at a water park. Because the grid is more than just a wire connecting you to a power plant. It's actually a circuit. It's wires connecting power plants to customers and back around to the power plants again. And you have to have that full loop, all the way in connection, or what you're going to get are blackouts. Likewise, the grid has to operate within these certain parameters. The electricity that flows along it has to move at frequency. And it has to move along at a constant depth, which is analogous to what we call voltage. And how you maintain that constant speed and constant depth is by maintaining an almost perfect balance between electric supply and electric demand. You have to maintain that 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, second by second. And if you don't, if it gets out of whack by even fractions of a percent, again, you're going to get blackouts. H.G. Rogers did not know this. And he made some key mistakes because of that. And particularly, he tried to save himself some money. His paper mill that I told you about was powered by a water wheel. So he thought he could hook up his electric generator to the same water wheel and get energy in two different directions for the price of one. The problem with this is that his paper mill had lots of customers. His electric generator had exactly one customer, which was H.J. Rogers himself. So on the days that the paper mill was running at full capacity, that little generator was producing far more electricity than his grid actually needed. And all throughout H.J. Rogers' $1 million mansion, lights went out pop, pop, pop. And each one of them cost the equivalent of $36. That became an expensive mistake. But even if H.J. Rogers had been technologically competent, and there were people who were technologically competent who started some of these early electric utilities, there's still a pretty good chance that he would have failed. And that's because he had a business problem. In 1882, there was exactly one thing that you could do with electricity, and that was light a light bulb. But you could not make enough money lighting light bulbs to recoup the costs of building the infrastructure necessary to light the light bulbs to begin with. This was a problem, and it wasn't just a problem for H.J. Rogers, it was actually a problem for a lot of different industries at the time. Up until the late 19th century, no one in America really had much experience running a business that required huge upfront costs and infrastructure development before you could even make money. The nationwide train systems were having a lot of the same sort of problems, and it ended up driving a lot of people out of business. H.J. Rogers eventually went bankrupt. People who bought the electric utility in Appleton from him also went bankrupt, and the people who bought it from them went bankrupt too. It wasn't until the late 1920s that anybody other than Thomas Edison really got rich off electricity. It only worked because utilities invented their own demand. They set about coming up with ways for people to use electricity and other things for them to do with it. And along the way, they invented the electric toaster oven, the electric curling iron, and they found all sorts of things to do with electric motors. If you've ever seen old photos from the 19th century, early 20th century, and you see that even these really small towns had these elaborate electric streetcar systems. For the most part, those systems were owned by electric utilities and were meant to be something that you could sell electricity to do during the day. The problem with a lot of this is that even though they were able to make money eventually, that only worked in cities. It only worked in places where you could build one infrastructure and serve a lot of people in this area. But the reality is that a lot of America wasn't in very dense areas. We weren't able to catch the entire country up to the same state of technological innovation, technological success, until the federal government stepped in between the 1930s and the 1950s and started spreading the cost of that infrastructure development across the entire country in the form of taxes. So when you look at the history of our electric grid, I think there are really three key things that you need to learn. First, the grid that we use today, it wasn't designed. Nobody actually sat down and planned this. It evolved. And in a lot of cases, it evolved in the hands of people who had absolutely no idea what they were doing. We can't look at this and assume that we have a really ideal system and that changing it is taking risks. In a lot of cases, changing it is eliminating risks or improving on what risks that we do have to take. The second thing that you need to learn is that a technology can fail for a really long time and still end up becoming a vital part of our lives today. I think there are a lot of good analogies between the history of the light bulb and the history of solar panels. Because I've had people tell me, well, solar cells have been around since the 1930s, and people have been pushing this as the happy energy system since the 1970s, but they're still pretty expensive, and they're still not something that a lot of people use, so clearly they're kind of a failure, and we should maybe just move on. But if you look at the light bulb, you can see that a technology can fail on a technological basis for 80 years, and then it can you and I use every single day and that we're utterly dependent on. Finally, you need to learn that big changes to the way that Americans live, they don't happen on an individual by individual basis. We don't have electricity and this projection system and these microphones in this classroom right now because one person at a time decided to wire their house up with electricity and just kind of made that decision independent of everyone else. We have this because of the complicated interplay between personal decisions, public decisions, business decisions, all of these things working together to enable everyone to kind of step up into this technology in mass. So this is the system that we have today. Well, let's talk a little bit about where this has gone since H.G. Rogers' time and what it looks like now. First off, we use a lot more electricity today than we did in H.G. Rogers' time. That part's pretty obvious. But what's interesting is that when the electric utilities set out to create demand, they ended up succeeding far beyond anybody's wildest imagination. Today, we use more energy to produce electricity than we do for any other reason in the United States, including transportation. It takes more energy to light our light bulbs and run our computers than it does to drive our cars. Another good thing that will kind of help you put this into context is if you look at American homes. Since the 1970s, our houses have gotten way more energy efficient. And we now build them tighter. We now build them with heating and cooling systems that are a lot more energy efficient. We're able to get more of the services we want for less energy in. But if you actually look at the amount of electricity used by the housing sector in the US, that hasn't really changed. In fact, it's actually gone up just a little bit. We don't use less, even though our houses are more energy efficient. And that's because during that same time period, the amount of things we plug into those houses has increased exponentially. We now have more TVs, we now have more appliances, we now have more gadgets and computers and cell phones, and all of those things add up to pretty much negate the energy efficiency benefits we got from building better houses. The second way that our electric system has changed is the production scale. Back in H.G. Rogers' time, electricity was a really local thing. You would have one tiny little power plant that would serve maybe a neighborhood, a big city, or maybe just one small town. But as you got this ever-increasing demand, one of the things that you found was that you also needed ever-increasing supply. And it was a lot cheaper to produce that ever-increasing supply in bulk. Same way that it's cheaper to go down to Sam's Club and buy toilet paper in bulk than it is to buy a roll one at a time. It's just cheaper to do things that way. Today, we produce electricity in these great big power plants that serve millions of customers at a time and are generally located pretty far away from the people that actually use that power. A really good example of this is out in Kansas. In western Kansas, there is a big controversy right now about the possible construction of 2 new coal-fired power plants. Those power plants would serve several hundred million customers. They are located in a part of Kansas that is 200 miles from the nearest town with more than 60,000 people in it. And that's because that electricity is not for Kansas, or at least it's not just for Kansas. It's meant to go to 7 different western states, including Kansas. And that's the way we produce electricity now. We make it in one place and ship it all over the country. Finally, our grid is also national today. And that's a big difference from H.G. Rogers' time. It's a big difference even from your grandparents' time. Up until the 1970s, it was still pretty common for towns to sort of exist as their own separate islands. Oshkosh wasn't connected to Appleton. Appleton wasn't connected to Milwaukee. They just basically had to produce what was demanded within their one little segment of a grid that didn't exist. That started to change really, really rapidly. Because again, as you have ever-increasing supply and ever-increasing demand, what you need is stability. You need to have redundancy. You need to be able to not have to rely on just what you can produce yourself. You have to be able to share resources. And so the grid became national. Everybody became linked together and joined into one big thing. But what we have today is still not really ideal. If it ever looks like we're making this up as we go along, that's because we are actually still making this up as we go along. What you see when you turn on a light is reliable. You pretty much know that you're going to be able to flip the switch and things will come on. You know, sometimes it won't, but for the most part, it's a reliable system. But just like in H.J. Rogers' time, the grid doesn't manage itself. You still have to have that perfect balance between electric supply and electric demand. And it doesn't just do that automatically. Instead, these are the guys who do that. This picture is from the Control Center for the Electric Reliability Council of Texas. Their control centers like this scattered all over the US and Canada. And this is the place where people work round the clock, every day, making sure that that balance between supply and demand is maintained. There are a couple of different ways that they can do that. First, these guys create predictions of what demand is going to be like on a given day. So they'll look at historical records and they'll look at weather forecasts. And they use that to try to figure out how much energy people are going to be using. Now, what actually happens is often pretty far off from those predictions. So they also have a lot of control over supply. They can get on the phone and call up power plants and ask them to produce less electricity or more electricity and ramp those things up and down until electric supply and electric demand match. These are really interesting places. The ERCOT Center is this giant room about the size of a really large movie theater. It's really cold, it's really dark, it's one whole wall covered in screens. And you walk in and it's just silent. It's like walking into some kind of cathedral. And that really surprised me because from my research, I knew that these guys were constantly stamping out small fires. You know, when I talk about maintaining that balance between supply and demand, that's something that's constantly going like this. It's not an easy thing to do, and I had sort of expected a much more frantic environment. I expected there would be alarms going off. And I asked them about this, and what they said was, they don't have alarms, because if they had alarms, they'd be going off so often that everyone would just start to ignore them. Now, these guys' job would be a lot easier if we had some of these. This is a battery at the scale of what we would use on the electric grid. It is about the size of a semi-truck. It costs several hundreds of millions of dollars, and it has to be shipped over from Japan. There is nowhere in the Western Hemisphere that makes these things. We don't really have any of these. We don't have any storage really at all to speak of. And that's an issue because it creates risk. Specifically, it creates risk of blackouts. Texas experienced this in winter of 2011. They had an unexpected cold front come through that the grid controllers hadn't predicted. And just as that cold front came through and people started turning up their electric heat and getting home from work and everything and trying to use more of their electricity, they also had the pipes freeze in several coal-fired power plants. So suddenly they had less supply and they had more demand and they got blackouts. They almost had the same thing happen again next summer from heat waves coming through. Those are a pretty big problem, and they're a problem that happens constantly. If you look at maps of where there are blackouts around the US, there are blackouts every day. We have this constant struggle to keep this grid actually working as well as we think it does. The other problem with not having storage is that it makes it harder for us to integrate wind and solar into our electric grid. That's because when our grid evolved, it evolved in concert with these sources of energy that the grid controllers call controllable power. And what that means basically is they can get on the phone and they can call somebody up and say produce more or produce less. And when you're talking about traditional sources of power, coal, natural gas, hydroelectric power, even nuclear to a certain extent, you're talking about something that can be controlled. Wind and solar are different. You can control them somewhat, but a lot of that is out of your control. If there's not enough wind, you can't ask that wind farm to produce more electricity. And that creates slight instabilities in an already slightly unstable system. It's not a huge problem right now because we don't have enough wind and solar on our grid for it to be a huge problem. But it's something that's going to become more and more complicated and add more and more instability to our system as we add more and more wind and solar to the grid. Experts tell me that we can get to between 20% and 30% of our electric supply from wind and solar before we're going to have to make big changes to how the grid works. And that includes adding in more storage. Now, the problem is storage is really, really, really expensive. So what are some other solutions that can help us integrate this and create more stability? you've heard the phrase smart grids. I'm sure that's kind of a buzzword. The key is that smart grids mean lots of different things. Smart grids, when we talk about it, we're talking about a dozen, 24 different technologies. Some of them you might ever come into contact with, and some of them you might not. And one of the technologies that we're talking about is this idea of demand response. Right now, grid controllers don't have much control at all over the demand side of that supply and demand equation. What little they do comes in the form of demand response customers, very large users of energy like a factory that are paid a premium by the utility company to be on call so that if there is a sudden fluctuation in supply and demand, the grid controller can call them up and ask them to use less electricity for a while. They're paid for doing that, and they're paid pretty handsomely for doing that. But right now, that's only available to the largest users of electricity. So it doesn't give the grid controllers a lot of control. It's just a couple of points rather than a lot of detailed control. Smart grids, and specifically some of these smart appliances, would give us the ability to expand this demand response market to people like you and I and to small businesses. Instead of shutting down all the electricity in your house, though, what we're talking about is taking an appliance that doesn't need to be on constantly for you to get the benefit from it. Like a refrigerator, for instance. You don't need to have that running all the time in order for your food to stay cold. And having that tied into the grid, so that when supply and demand get out of whack, 5 million refrigerators can just shut off for a minute or two and help the grid controllers get everything back under control. Now, you'd be paid for that service, but it's still kind of a creepy thing, right? Like having somebody else in charge of your air conditioner or your refrigerator, there's some discomfort involved in that. So people have been doing studies about how to make that something that the American public is actually interested in participating in. And out at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory in Oregon, they have found some good ways. The big thing that they found is that if you give people control of the system, if you give them like a little box that allows them to opt in and opt out on any day they want, maybe one day they want to participate and one day they don't. If you give them the ability to kind of see what they're getting paid so that they can make their decisions based on, is that rate worth it to me today? Most of the time, they don't even notice that the refrigerator is clicking on and off. Most of the time, they never actually opt out. It's just the ability to have that control makes people feel more comfortable and makes this system that can help our grid controllers and can help our grid as a whole actually function. But while that is cheaper than that is, demand response is still kind of an expensive thing. In fact, everything's expensive. When you're talking about infrastructure, you're never talking about cheap. And that can be kind of an issue. If you've ever wondered why utility companies cling to these great, big, dirty, old coal-fired power plants that nobody likes, that's because those power plants are paid off. So when you're asking them to build a new, cleaner power plant, it's kind of like going up to somebody who's already paid off their mortgage and asking them to buy a second home. It's not always the most easy argument to make. But we have to keep making these arguments. We have to keep trying to help the utility companies understand this, because it's not really a punishment thing. It's about investing in the future. If we focus too much on the short term, where those investments are expensive, we'll lose sight of the long term, where those investments pay off. And those investments can pay off, both for them and for our nation. First off, if we can change our grid, we're going to make something that's a lot stronger. This isn't just about how we build a utopia and make the world safe for wind and solar. This is about how we maintain reliability on a system that we're more dependent on than we've ever been in our entire history. We need electricity to do our jobs, to live our lives, to even feed ourselves. And if we don't have that, we run into huge problems, and it costs money. If you look at things like Hurricane Sandy or like the 2002 blackout on the East Coast, those are events that cost billions and billions of dollars in productivity, in repairs. Some of these kind of improvements to the grid infrastructure are things that can save that money in the long term. As we change the grid, we're also likely to make it a lot more local. That's because it is still cheaper to produce electricity in bulk and ship it to lots of different people, but some of that is changing. And some of that is changing because of the cost of transmission. Right now, when you build a power plant, you have to run these transmission lines across several states. And as you're doing that, you're crossing lots of people's property, you're crossing federal lands. And every mile is a potential lawsuit, every mile is a payment that you have to make, or land that you have to buy. And all of that cost adds up, to the point that it can actually be more expensive to build the transmission lines that feed a power plant than it is to build the power plant itself. Now, the good news about this is that it opens up some opportunities for us to take advantage of renewable resources at a more local scale that we've never been able to really get at before. Hydroelectric power is a really good example of this. Right now in the United States, we've pretty much tapped out our major large-scale hydroelectric resources. We're never going to have another river dam because we don't have a place to build another river dam. But if you look at small-scale hydroelectricity, we have the power to increase our hydroelectric capacity in this country by 50%. And we would do that by focusing on small places where you don't even have to build dams, where you can just make a cut in the river so that part of the river flows into a power plant and then back into the river again. They're cheaper to build, they're better for the environment, they take up less space, and they allow us to get at resources that right now are just kind of going to waste. I'm going to give you another Kansas example. I grew up there, which is why I have all of these Kansas examples. Kansas is not a particularly wet state. It's part of the Great American Desert. It doesn't really have any really good rivers, like you call it a creek, but our river is. And right now in the state of Kansas, we have about 1 megawatt of hydroelectric capacity. That's enough for about 4,000 homes. But if we could build out the capacity that we have for the smaller scale hydroelectric power plants, Kansas could have 300 megawatts of hydroelectric capacity, enough for several 100,000 homes. That's not enough to get the state off of coal interacting with it differently, especially if you're the kind of person who wants to be more than just a consumer of electricity. Right now, you can take a solar panel, you can stick it on your house, you can start generating electricity. In some states, you can even start selling that electricity back into the electric grid and make some money. The problem is, when you do that, you're a blind spot to the grid controllers. They can't see you. They have no idea that you're there. They know that there is more electricity on the grid. They don't know where it's coming from. They have no way to control it. Again, this is not a problem yet. We don't have enough people doing this yet. But as more people want to be suppliers of electricity and not just consumers of it, we're going to have to take some steps that allow them to participate in the grid the same way that those great big mega power plants do. This is another thing we talk about when we're talking about smart grids. We're talking about smart meters. Right now, a lot of people, I don't know about around here, but a lot of people have dumb meters, which are really, really dumb. They're read once a month, essentially by like a walkie-talkie thing. Somebody drives by your house in a van. They don't give the kind of information that grid controllers need if you're going to be producing electricity on your house. Smart meters change that equation. They allow the grid controllers to have minute-by-minute updated information about what you're producing and what you're taking. And they also allow the grid controllers to stop the flow of electricity from your house to the grid when they need to. If there's too much electricity on the grid, they have to do that, just like they would for a large-scale power plant. Now, I've talked about a lot of different solutions, a lot of different kinds of change. And it's hard to imagine where all of this stuff comes from, how you kind of start getting it to happen. And usually in a talk like this is the point where somebody starts telling you about 101 things that you can do to save the planet. And unfortunately, I can't do that. Because as we've already talked about, this kind of change doesn't happen one person at a time. This doesn't happen because you and I each decide to do something good. It happens because we all come together and make these large infrastructure-level changes. And it's not just the electric infrastructure, it's all sorts of infrastructures. Transportation is another big thing. I live in Minneapolis right now, and I can walk out my front door and get on the number 6 bus, go anywhere in the city I need to go. We have great bicycle infrastructure, so I can ride all summer. And because of that, my husband and I can get by with just one car. But if I went down to Kansas City, where most of my family lives, that's not an option. They don't have public transportation to work anything. They don't really have bicycle lanes or bicycle trails. So telling them to get rid of a car is sort of like telling them to shoot themselves in the foot. Without that second car, they can't access their jobs, they can't get to the services they want. They can't even participate in their communities. We have to change that infrastructure. can expect people to make those individual decisions. One kind of feeds into the other. And the infrastructure, the systems, are really the big part of it. Right now, electricity, our big system, our infrastructure is flawed. And there's only so much that you and I can do within that flawed system to make a difference in how well it's going to support us in the future, and in how sustainable it can possibly be. So what you have to do is change the system. If there's one thing that you take away from this entire talk, this should be it. Energy is not your personal choices. Energy isn't even the sources of power that we choose. Energy is systems. And until we change those systems, we're not going to make a lot of headway on the sources of choices. Thank you very much.